Dear friends, I am glad to welcome everyone to the Feigen Life channel today, Tuesday, February 10th. 21 hours in Kiev, 22 hours in Moscow. We are holding another stream on our channel. And after a break, we meet with Vitaly Portnikov again. Vitaly, I'm glad to see you. Welcome. Well, we called the broadcast agent Epstein, Trump and Ukraine, as if trying to link together all three topics. It is clear that Ukraine is the main object of attention for us, and the topic is, well, Trump Postolko. Since Agent Epstein, here I want to say that as soon as the main array of almost 3.5 million Epstein files was published by a decision of Congress, everyone rushed to discuss whether they buried virgins there. Or there are these minors. Whether they slept with them and so on. I still attribute this to the justice authorities, and I think they should sort out everyone there who needs to be dug up. And who needs to be put in jail. But this is different. After all, the emphasis has somehow shifted altogether from a huge array of files that reflect Epstein's own special, if not close, and maybe even more relations with the Kremlin and with Moscow. After all, he could just have his own island, have a relationship, and just do girls. But no, there are ears everywhere. That's where only Nikin, up to even the commissars of the movement. Not ours. That is, everything is there, everything. And the appeal to Churkin, and Lavrov, and Putin, and Massifile, some Russian modeling agencies, obviously so to speak. Vspshny, obviously Vspshny. All this together gives reason to believe that, after all, we put it in the headline, this is Agent Epstein. Well, let's say, an agent of influence, or a trusted person, or a confidant. Well, it doesn't matter how it's not about definitions. But we are throwing a bridge to Trump. It is clear that he was not always on good terms with Epstein. We know how it ended up about the villa in Florida. And then to Ukraine. And here's the thought that haunts us here. How really Trump can be, not being an agent of Krasnov. We even reject these versions. God be with them. But depending on the fact that some records, slept with girls back and forth, or maybe not of age, were transferred to Moscow by Epstein. And now we are at an impasse in achieving at least some small-scale goals regarding Moscow's participation in the war in Ukraine. Do you understand? Because they can always, hello, do you remember? We have records of you burying virgins or someone else in Mar-a-Lago, Here's the logic as far as it can affect. Well, naturally, we will discuss everything, but here's how to interconnect these things, and maybe we will never break out of this impasse. Not to mention the fact that so far there is no practical evidence of Trump's involvement in Epstein's crimes. All this can only be speculation. After all, if at least some evidence does not appear sometime, it will be a different story. But I generally think that the situation with Epstein is a much deeper and more dangerous situation than one can imagine. Because here you say that the ears of the KGB, the FS stick out, and this is a story that lasted for a decade. So I recently wrote a text on this topic, and I called it, as strange as it may sound, it seems to be a signet. Because when I was in Solitvino, in a Ukrainian village on the border with Romania, I was looking at Syed. I realized that I was doing exactly the same thing that young Robert Maxwell was doing. He was born there, in Solid. Well, I was born on the Ukrainian side. Not in Romanian, but in Ukrainian. Well, on the current Ukrainian territory, yes, of course, he was born in Ukraine. There is a large Jewish cemetery there, where his relatives who died before the Holocaust are buried. Because his whole family died in the Holocaust. And Maxwell, as you know, was a man closely connected with Moscow, with his youth. Oh yes, it's true, yes, of course. Apparently, he began to cooperate with Moscow. Even when he was responsible for the operation of transferring Czechoslovak weapons to Israel in 1948. It is clear that thank God that these weapons were handed over, but we must understand the motives that guided Stalin. He also wanted to turn Israel into a fortress of the Soviet Union in the Middle East. Yes, the bastion in the Middle East is communist. And Maxwell helped this very thing, not just to save the Jewish state, he carried out an assignment, as he later published books by Brezhnev. Honecker, Zhivkov, one might say, legitimized Soviet propaganda in the Pergamon press. And it was also a long-term relationship of a man who was a lord, who was a successful publisher. And it was Robert Maxwell who introduced his daughter Ghislaine to Epstein. He gave Epstein money, which many people generally believe made Epstein a financier. And after the mysterious death of Robert Maxwell, no one still fully understands what happened to him. On a yacht in the Canaries. He just fell into the water. Yes. So he swam and fell. Well, yes. After that, Ghislaine Epstein, who is Shepstein, yes, Ghislaine Maxwell, who then lived in the United States, she. It turns out that Epstein's closest companion and accomplice. Well, that is, in fact, this story Maxwell probably did not accidentally introduce her to Epstein. What do you think? And he gave money for a reason too. Yes, I mean, it's very similar to some kind of Oxford or some kind of Forth. Just at the level of Western billionaires. Therefore, we do not know at all what Maxwell and Ghislaine are for, because Ghislaine is now in prison on these charges, and refuses to give any testimony to Congress. In general, all these orgies were needed. Maybe they needed them, not because they got a lot of pleasure, but because they got a lot of guidance. Well, quite, and why not, of course. Honey is this bait. Yes, and the ability to record everything, and the ability to find out everything. And it could have been Robert Maxwell's most ingenious operation for all the time of his cooperation with the state security agencies of the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation. Well, he didn't have time to cooperate with the security agencies of the Soviet Union. He died just a few months before the collapse of the Soviet Union. But he successfully cooperated with the Soviet authorities. At least his daughter could have carried out this special operation. Because she understood, so to speak, what Dad would want. So in this sense, and again, you see how Moscow takes these people forever. Here she can speculate on Israel. After all, this is also such a story. You let's carry out our assignment, and we will give weapons to Israel there, or we will not do something there. They exploit national feelings of security. They use any techniques. Therefore, everyone, and why are all these people? They generally turned out to be like businessmen of Jewish origin, who have nothing to do with the Soviet Union. Why were they so close to Moscow? Because speculation. Because the opinion is that, yes, I have billions, but I can help my small country. By keeping Russia or the Soviet Union from attacking Israel, from helping Egypt more. You can do anything to invent for yourself, and Moscow will contribute to this. Here, too, is a good illustration of what happens with similar stories. And that's why we really don't know until the end what kind of array of information. But I think that the fact that Moscow can just stupidly blackmail Trump, it looks conspiratorial. Because I'm not sure that the information that Putin has is not available anywhere else. And Trump can understand that too. In other words, you think he has some kind of non-exclusive, Moscow has, perhaps, non-exclusive material. And Trump has less motivation, because it's not only she who can have him, they're not for orgies or something else, maybe not. Be guided by the consideration of dependence on Moscow. And you are 100% convinced that Trump participated in orgies. Well, I don't know, something like that. Here you have no doubt. Well, listen, he's generally of this nature. Again, up to what point? After all, Bill Clinton is absolutely right when he says that both people who, in principle, communicated with Erstein, up to a certain point, went to this island, and people who then participated in various events there. And the people who participated in the crimes are three different things. Well, of course. Connections with Epstein, which, by the way, may also be connections with Soviet and Russian intelligence. Connections with Epstein, to date girls, to use Epstein's island as a brothel. Well, it's immoral, of course, but it's not a crime. Not a crime, of course. And the third point is a crime. This is usage. There is no understanding yet. And these are three different categories of people. That is, it is clear that there are people who have been in each of them. But nonetheless. Therefore, I do not have an answer to the question of how much Epstein's files are related to Trump's dependence on Putin. It seems to me that Trump simply perceives Putin as a kind of example of how a strong leader should act. Don't you think? In other words, he may think that Putin does not have the resources to act like this, but he believes that he himself can act like this. So, 10,000 viewers have already joined us. We're just there. Almost 11 minutes on the air, and to almost and a half, a little less. Thousands have put likes. Big request right now. Put a like, links to this broadcast, post them in your accounts in social media groups, and help us distribute them as widely as possible. This broadcast, because, among other things, I will also talk about it today, in Russia. Both Telegram and YouTube have already started actively blocking, they are already writing about it everywhere, and so on. We will say this on purpose later. But the best way is to subscribe to the Figan Life channel right now, subscribe and not. Contact us directly and on the channel of Vitaly Portnikov. In the description of this video by the name of Vitaly Portnikov, you will find a channel and you can subscribe, watch the video there. Moreover, the broadcast goes both there and there. Let's go further. Then the next question. Let's go in, that's the side, Vitaly. Is it possible to say that Trump is definitely losing the November elections to the House of Representatives, 1/3 of the Senate, and 36 governors, who, by the way, will be re-elected, and understanding this drives him in his specific actions now? Relatively speaking, I need to justify myself, I need to shield myself somehow. I will carry out an operation as successful as with Maduro, with Iran, and clap me, he will say, well, yes, of course. He may be an asshole, but still he did a good deed, he saved the world from evil. And the same thing can be transferred to the issue with Ukraine. Moreover, public opinion will support Ukraine by 70%, the American one both supported and supports it. Recent polls continue to show this. In other words, he should follow public opinion on this issue too. In other words, it turns out that dependence on Epstein's files, which affect the outcome of the choice in November, forces Trump to act in a certain way in some algorithm, yes, obeying the demand of the majority, or public opinion. Well, that is, as in Faust Goethe, where is the power that tralala, you know? Here's what you think about it. I think that Trump's defeat in the by-elections, in all I would say, sectors of these by-elections, is absolutely not predetermined. Yes, he may lose the House of Representatives, but this does not mean that Republicans will lose their majority in the Senate. I'm not sure about that yet. If this happens, it means that before November, Trump needs to figure out something else so extraordinary. Because there are also many Republican districts in the Senate, where, in principle, the Democrats have never particularly won. If they win this time, then Trump is just a wizard in terms of the possibility of a Democratic one. Well, you know, even if representatives win in the House, then the beginning of the impeachment procedure. I'm not saying that it will come to impeachment, but the beginning itself, the investigation, the outcry, the press, and so on. He will have other main pains. Yes, that's for sure. I believe that the House of Representatives, if the Democrats win there, will impeach him for the third time. It just won't lead to anything if it doesn't matter. It won't, yes. He will sit for 2 years after that, let's say. But his head will be filled with excuses for others, eternal excuses for what he did during this year, or during this year. And for what he did not do, but could have done. That's what I would say. Here. I believe there is no war with Iran. And no peace process in Ukraine will help him. Because Americans vote for completely different reasons. I completely agree with you that the overwhelming majority of Americans continue to support Ukraine. This can be seen in sociology, it can be seen simply even on American streets, where there are American ones. And Ukrainian flags are nearby, according to the statements of ordinary people. But this is not their first regular problem. That's the thing. Let's imagine that Trump managed to end the Russian-Ukrainian war, and in all other respects, he remained Trump for Americans. From an economic point of view, nothing. It won't change anything. The only thing that he certainly does not want to be reproached for making impossible promises. Because he promised to end Russia's war against Ukraine in a week. Well, yes. And then there was a week, more than a year has passed, we see his absolute helplessness. And the Russian only emphasizes this helplessness. Therefore, I completely agree that he wants to end the Russian-Ukrainian war as soon as possible, and pressure is associated with this. The question is whether it can. That's a good question. I am not at all convinced that he has such opportunities, really. Well, look, give Tomahawk missiles, taking responsibility for at least this one. He can, right? Maybe, yes. That's a good one. As I was demanded, I gave it. What's next? Well, the war could not. Well, I gave away the rockets. Yes, he did everything possible to put further pressure on Putin. Yes. Well, perhaps this is the logic of pressure, that I will push harder in 4 months. I give them 4 months to stop it. It's just not clear why he puts pressure on Ukraine at the same time, what he wants from Ukraine. From his point of view, what should Ukraine do to stop the war? To agree with the transfer of the territory of Donbass, it will definitely end if Zelensky will agree to these conditions of Putin. That's what. Why are they discussing the algorithm of choice in Ukraine at all at these negotiations? What does Russia care about the Ukrainian elections? That's always a question for me too. Or there's some kind of strange referendum. Why is it believed that the end of the war should be associated with Moscow's interference in the internal affairs of Ukraine? Ukraine should hold elections when it is possible from the point of view of logic, procedure, and decisions of the Ukrainian parliament, and not Russian negotiators, right? And American. Well, that's a good question too. But in any case, I fully admit that Putin will just have to live up to the moment when Trump will increase pressure on him. Putin is just stalling for time, just before the election, realizing that Trump would then have to behave completely differently in politics in general. In other words, he is weakened as much as possible, and for Putin at this moment, it is precisely this position and this status that will suit him. Yes, how was it with Biden? That Biden, on the one hand, wanted to help Ukraine, and on the other hand, Trump and Mike Johnson blocked the aid package for months. Yes. Of course, we have discussed it many times. Here we say that Putin is dragging his feet until January 20th, 29, but he can drag his time until November 20th, 26. This is also delaying time. All procrastination of time. According to different deadlines, according to different paradigms. Because then the Democrats will demand more help from Trump to Ukraine, and he will resist or not resist. But this will be a completely different story. Putin will tell him, you put more pressure on this Ukraine so that the war ends, otherwise the Democrats will completely bite you. Let Ukraine itself agree to all the conditions. At the same time, Russia's position does not change at all. Here's a look at what Lavrov says. We must liberate our ancestral lands. We were promised everything in the withdrawal and did not fulfill it. We promised, here I love it, that the conditions for the termination of war against Ukraine is a large-scale economic cooperation with the United States of America and Russia. And how should we provide them with this cooperation in Ukraine? Why do they even put the end of the war depending on their agreement with America for money? In other words, we are hostages of their desire to earn money, it turns out. They are hitting the Ukrainian energy sector, leaving women, children, elderly people without heat for months. Because Putin wants to negotiate with Trump on the money. He says, if you don't agree on the money, I'll freeze these people. Look at this. This is such a typical KGBist blackmail. You know, here we have brought your wife, give her the money, or we will, so to speak, put her out in the cold. Oh well, by the way, I completely forgot that. It's his favorite textbook of life. The film 17 Moments of Spring. Remember, there's been stripped of the child. Yes. Rodiska cat. She had to tell everything because she was undressing her baby. Yes. In the cold. This is just the perfect picture for Putin. And he's not some kind of Barbara. The USSR, he is a sadist, so to speak, on a larger scale. He can generally just leave the whole city without light, so that Trump thinks, begins to testify. That's the logic, you know. You can't show Soviet TV series to people. This is understandable. It is not necessary to prohibit Telegram, but Lesny. Because it has a destructive effect on the immature psyche of KGB initiators. He does sometimes, it seems to me that he lives in this movie. Thinks he's a Sturlitz. Or maybe Mueller, I don't know who his favorite hero is there. We think that he has a favorite hero Kalm, and he has a favorite hero Hitler. Hitler, perhaps, Hitler, probably, after all, yes. Or someone like that. Well, in short, not a Russian person, he has a favorite hero. Not a Russian person. Not Russian exactly, yes. Russians, of course, hate to hear this, but I'm afraid that the Russian president likes a German character, so to speak. As an example, to follow some kind of Muger or Schelling. So this is an intuitive study. The Russian elite, it's in the 19th, well, the house of the Romanovs, was it made up of Russians? Not, of course, not of Russians consisted. Yes, in this and here, and Peter is dancing next to me. Despite the fact that this tramp, in general, so to speak, it is unclear that he always wanted to be near the gentleman. Of course. So he took over their tents, of course. This is close to Nemakina, this is the whole story. That is, of course, yes, of course, he was always stylized under them. And here the scale, as they say, why not? So, it means that more than 14,000 have already joined us, not bad either. To start the week, today is only Tuesday, and 3,625 have already put likes. Please do not sit, help, distribute. You see for yourself what is happening with the Russian audience, and we need to help. It means that you can see our ethers, and this can only be achieved by mechanically pressing the button. So don't forget to subscribe to our channels as well. Then let's go with another story. After all, Iran. Iran is a closer target because there is more real in it. In Amman, on Friday, the negotiations ended in nothing. As all negotiations with Putin, by the way, also ended. By the way, they ended up with nothing with Venezuela, too. After all, it was also an action that replaced the meaningless course of these endless discussions. And yet, it is effective, both with Venezuela, now they have even voted for a general amnesty, and with Iran, in general. It is getting closer. With all the forces already pulled together, it is already possible to shoot at any time. Well, let's say it happens on Friday, when it will be, as usual, as it began on June 13th, the 12-day war by Israel. On Friday, when they have prayer there, and so on, and so on. That is, to take advantage of the situation. It is quite possible to assume that the shelling will begin exactly in some such range. Again, we don't know, it's us guessing. But nevertheless, here's what I said above, Trump really, in your opinion, will go for such a radical replacement of one news stream with another, that is, related to the Epstein files. And the explosion of discontent, obvious, yes, that it will show some kind of force that can. Well, at least Republican. To reassemble the electorate, yes, that is. For a moment, a short moment, but this can happen, because in February the electorate is being gathered for November. Well, we'll have to do this until November. That's what it's about, but that's all that's coming now. And if you do nothing, the situation will fly even deeper into this funnel. In other words, you will have to demonstrate them until November. Well, logically, it is clear that this is not solved. I think there could be a threatening moment for Trump, and why is he putting it all off? Because he may be afraid that he will do all this, and it won't change anything. So, and then the question arises, who? To no avail. Imagine that the regime of Venezuela will not change until November. For example, he will strengthen this regime and again refuse to supply oil. Imagine that he will strike Iran, and the regime will remain in Iran. Imagine that he puts pressure on Putin, and Putin still won't stop the war. How unsafe is it for Trump to come to November 20th, 26 in the aureola of helplessness? That he did everything, but nothing changed. This is also a moment that can stop him. It will demonstrate its inefficiency, let's say. Yes, that's right. Here I am doing all this, and this is Khamenei coming out and threatening me. Also imagine that Iran will still fire at some American objects, hit some aircraft carrier or some Houthis. By the way, they don't hear something, but nothing, but they can manifest themselves at any moment. That's it for you. Well, that is, as far as he is confident of absolute success, as far as his advisors say about, hit Iran. You will get everything. After all, he has already lost in Iran, when he promised to help the protesters, and then said that he would not do anything. And actually gave Ayatollah Khamenei the opportunity to suppress this protest. In other words, I have no confidence that American military assistance in the form of bombing regime facilities would accelerate its strong fall. But as a result, she didn't come at all. And now the Iranian protesters may think that the United States has betrayed them. Here they would have struck, we would have won. This mode would not exist. They didn't do anything. And everyone has already said, here in Iran, there is a protest leader, Reza Shah. The last Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. And how great is his authority now, after he actually counted on American help, and they believed that he could provide it. Many protesters, but nothing happened. I mean, there's a lot of questions, you know. Do you think that Trump will not take action with answers to these questions? In other words, he will not respond precisely by saying that it is better late than never. Maybe, but that's only if it leads to a result. Will lead. Inaction in this case is more dangerous. Well, you see, you and I, if we were the national security advisors to the President of the United States right now, we would think for a long time, right? You would tell Trump inaction is worse than action, because everyone will see your helplessness. And I would say, he is the president of everyone. And what if you hit, nothing will happen? How will this affect you? Well, for example, I mean, in many ways, this situation is hopeless. Because any decision can be wrong. In other words, we can easily think through options with him. And Trump needs one option that will lead to success, that is, to the collapse of the Iranian regime, to the transformation of Iran into a normal state. But don't forget that China is behind all these stories. Yes, of course, this is one of them. In the end, this is the most important thing to buy China. Venezuelan, Iranian and Russian oil. Yes, of course. Without China, none of this would have happened. Therefore, it may be necessary to look for the root of evil where it is really accepted. It is clear that a war with China is impossible, so to speak, in any case, in the form in which it can happen with Iran or. Economic pressure is possible in Venezuela, real economic pressure is possible. This is part of the economic pressure. This is the part? To cut off these threads of possible access to cheap energy resources is also a serious blow to Beijing's capabilities. It's obvious. So that China buys American oil, right? Well, the Persian Gulf. The United States depends on Chinese rare earths, and China depends on the oil of the Persian Gulf. Which means that it depends on the productivity of the crab. The perfect model. It just arises how much Xi Jinping is willing to put up with this. Will he just sit and watch? And what can he do now in the situation with Iran? That's what we're not even talking about Putin right now. And what can he do? He can give you something, yes, strengthening the regime's potential in terms of air defense. Although I think it is surmountable. Which America has, it's all surmountable. I think there's nothing they can do. Neither Iran, nor Beijing, nor Moscow can do anything at all. They can give anti-aircraft defenses and so on, but it's all by itself. To give flights, well, what is possible? To give missiles, well, so that with these ballistic or cruise missiles. It means firing at military facilities on the territory of these neighboring states, where US military bases are located. But all this may not give any effect at all. And this is very dangerous, as you know, these are the Chinese. The missiles will hit the American military base. Moreover, it is dangerous for China. Yes, it is dangerous for China, of course. Because then the analysis will be of a different scale. Well, that is, you believe that it is impossible to answer in the affirmative unequivocally, that there will be an operation in Iran. Especially what you said. I think Trump thinks about it every day. Even if there is some planned date, Mark, I think that at any moment he can refuse this date. Because this is a very difficult decision, because it still has unpredictable consequences. Well, yes. After all, the question is whether this will really help the collapse of the regime or, on the contrary, rally its base. By the way, we will now see what will happen to Cuba after this blockade. Well, I think there's going to be a serious one. And they are dictated by Rubio, who is Cuban. And he heads the State Department and is the protagonist, initiator of all operations in North and South America. Against these regimes and so on. Now they and Colombia in general have reached an agreement, invited this left-wing asshole to their place, agreed on everything. And so on, in Mexico they decide there. Well, it will be decided from Cuba. By the way, it's a military issue, you know, I've been to Cuba since Cuba. Guantanamo base is located right in Cuba. What are they going to talk about anyway? Or maybe why is the base located in Cuba? Americans have tolerated Fidel Castro's regime for so long, 4 decades. It's simple, they followed after the Caribbean. The agreements that really existed between Moscow and Washington were relatively not to touch this regime. Why do they continue to follow now, given that all possible, conceptual, other, legal and so on agreements have been violated? Even missile treaties no longer work, START and everything else. Well, I don't know, it's already a mystery to me, to be honest. Well, that's a good question. It's not just Trump. This regime has not been touched by any of the presidents since the Cold War. And Barack Obama flew to Havana in general. Well, yes. Performed with the Kostova trawl. The question arises as to how much they considered it possible to preserve the communist tyranny, from which 2/3 of the Cuban population fled. Well, nevertheless. And we are well aware that precisely because 2/3 fled, this tyranny that is now there, it is stable from the point of view of the base. Because the base of such regimes is supporters and indifferent. Although, again, I think that there are not only indifferent people, there are also a huge number of people who are intimidated there. Who are simply intimidated by this regime. Well, and I don't really understand what Trump wants to do. Does he want to eliminate this regime or make it loyal, as in Venezuela? Well, maybe the second one, and the second one maybe, but there is such a degree of loyalty at which this regime loses all support, all sovereignty. Because the Venezuelans, many will critically evaluate, but now there are already some movements towards what definitely indicates that the Venezuelan regime will be transformed. They will not be able not to do this, especially since it is really already possible to state that Venezuelan oil is accurately distributed through a decision in connection. The United States in Washington. And this is the determining economic factor. Well, of course, because, in fact, it was the money from oil that kept this regime. Well, yes. If they don't have the money, they will lose any election. They have already lost any election. With oil. Well, for this it is necessary that they hold elections, And for this it is necessary that the Cubans hold elections. After all, there are no elections in Cuba at all. I don't remember how many years it has been, because I could tell from the moment when Fidel Castro seized power. But there were no elections under President Batista either. Well, there are their own to explain to Cubans that they can vote, for example, how to explain to Soviet people that there is an alternative. They have never encountered this alternative. None of those who live in modern Cuba have ever participated in any elections. Do you understand? Because this regime itself has been in existence for almost 80 years, while there was a military dictatorship before that. So, consider that in order to participate in some even conditional elections, it is unclear when you should have been born. And how long should you live? In any case, the experience of living in democracy, among people living in Cuba, does not exist a priori. Remember how it was said in the Soviet Union that elderly people who lived in Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia still remember what elections are. And all the rest did not know what it is, had to learn. They have a giant close immigration. Cuban immigration who lives in Florida, who lives in the southern states. And they, in general, can look at what democracy looks like from a close distance. This immigration wave back, she can just overcome these problems. But for this it is necessary to clean up. There was no such thing in Russia. There was no one to come back, so to speak, who is a Soviet man will come back and tell you about a free world. Well, that is, the immigrants of the first wave were old, the second was also very old. So to speak, Jewish immigration, the third. But she wasn't going to go back, there was no reason for her to go back there. So other factors played a role here. And in Cuba, it's all quite fast here. Just like in Venezuela. I lived in Florida for a few months at the beginning of last year. There is a huge amount of Venezuelan business there, which means a huge number of Venezuelans, developers, and so on. That is, even for them, it is a return, especially since they have their own leaders, and even mashads. And there were all sorts of unelected presidents, so to speak, who did not pass, because they were not given, and so on. Illegitimate persons, Guaido was like that. It's somehow easier for them. Simpler, after all. Therefore, the cube here is too microscopic a subject for it to be difficult to implement all this there. There you can just cover it all from above and so on. All right, then let's have 35 minutes, that's what we'll talk about. Let's go back to Ukraine, it's closer for us. We will evaluate, through a certain course of geopolitical events, but we will return again to what is close to us. Winter is coming to an end, that is, it still remains for a good to conditionally and a half weeks. 28 days in February and so on. Well, 18 days, Consider it the 17th. What's next? So to say, can we expect a new offensive from Moscow in the context? And Moscow will make a breakthrough, probably. We understand this, many people write about it. To further worsen the situation in Ukraine, despite the fact that over the cold. So, the lack of heat, for example, will no longer be felt so acutely. Well, water and electricity all the same, of course, it does not affect. Here. And then what? In other words, Moscow is still laying down the goal of achieving results either by peaceful agreements or by military means. In 2026, or even now, this concept is further, so it means to continue a protracted war, it is calmly perceived. And they are preparing for a protracted one. More precisely, they are already continuing a protracted war, and within the framework of this concept, they will proceed in solving their tasks, plans, and their implementation. I believe that Putin, on the one hand, is ready to stall until January 2029. And consider that Trump's tenure as president provides him with such an opportunity. On the other hand, the current state of the Russian economy, of course, requires Putin to end the war as soon as possible. Simply on his own terms. This is the main point that I want to say. And this is, I would say, an ambivalent position. On the one hand, here we have a wonderful Trump, who will not do anything serious against us, so we can safely continue to fight. And ensure that Ukraine capitulates, because we have a president who cannot give them tomahawks, which will not impose any new sanctions against Russia. We, at least, will do everything possible so that he does not maintain this illusion in his negotiations. Let him believe. So, this is on the one hand. But on the other hand, we have our own economy, which does not allow us to look far. Therefore, it would be better for us if Ukraine surrendered earlier. Not in 2028, conditionally, but in 2026. Because we don't have the strength to drag out so much time anymore. I think that this motive is determined. A protracted war is good only if Russia has the resources for a protracted war. You can see that even many Russian economists who said that it is stable, this economy and so on, are now abandoning their ideas. No, well, time has passed. It's not particularly stable. In other words, it is simply clear that the elements of corrosion have been outlined precisely by 2026. They could have done it earlier, they could have done it later, but these elements, they obviously exist. And Putin can also see that they exist. Therefore, I would say that yes, Putin does bet on a protracted war, but no, he does not have enough forces for a protracted war. Therefore, perhaps they will try to organize some kind of offensive, something else, but I am not sure that they have the strength for some kind of decisive offensive. This may also be another illusion. You see, in this war, as you can see, there are no decisive offensives anymore. The technology of war itself has changed. What has been the decisive attacks from the Ukrainian or the Russian side? They didn't decide anything. And technologies are developing at an accelerated pace, as you can see. It was enough for the Russians to turn off the Stavlin, which they are illegal or semi-legally used. And where, by the way, is the GLONASS system? I want to ask. Yes, by the way, I also asked this question. I say, they told us so much about this GLONASS, so it turns out that it never existed, apparently. Yes, GLONASS is an opportunity to steal countries. We have great atomic scientists who are developing an atomic bomb for us. But the secret is not at all in Karaton with Zeldovich, not in Kirkitev, not in this atomic project. But the secret of the Rosenberg spouses, yes, who stole and handed over the secret. Which were stolen and handed over. That is, in fact, it is clear why Barry was in charge of this project. Because these nuclear physicists simply imitated the activity, but in fact it was just necessary to steal. Well, it's clear that when you steal a project, it needs to be finalized, implemented, of course. Yes, but there was never any Soviet atomic bomb. I definitely agree, yes. It's just plain theft. They are thieves. The state of pickpockets. Well, and now they stole Starlinka from the mask. They didn't fight for a while. By the way, it is unclear why it was impossible to do all this before, because it has been talked about for a long time. These are technical issues in which we are with you. Let's be honest, Vitaly Eduardovich does not cut. Well, I'm just answering this question like that. How is this possible? But it turned out that a certain defense minister, who was the Minister of Digitalization, should appear in order to solve this like this. During the day. You see, not what Mass said, oh, I think it is. A complex technical solution. It was solved in 24 hours. Well, it is clear that Mask, as an entrepreneur, absolutely does not need anyone to use his services illegally. Everyone says, oh, he excused his political views. This is not a question of political views. This is a question about the fact that you bought a service from me, relatively speaking, the use of the internet. And your neighbor uses the same internet. They don't pay me a penny for what, actually. I'll disconnect your neighbor. Moreover, this neighbor regularly comes to your apartment with an axe and finds your apartment. Thanks to my internet. No, I'm sorry. Let him sit with his axe and kill the old lady, as you know, as they love. That's it. Therefore, these are also important moments. If we understand with you how difficult the situation with resources is, then this is also a good question, like us. It seems to me. So, 41 minutes we are on the air. We have literally a few minutes left. We will not be on a trip much, he is in Italy, so we will not detain him much, but it is still of the keenest interest to us. There are a number of other issues that require discussion. Nevertheless, let's talk about Putin again. In continuation of what we said, it's probably both. Here we talked about the economy, but here is the personal factor. After all, this year he is 74 years old, so to speak, this is a year for him, well, as if the 5th year of the war will go in just a few weeks. Is it possible to say that he is approaching the horizon of the Rubicon, when his age does not allow him to drag out time forever? Forever and inversely proportional to the continuation of the war, and the success of this continuation? Well, that's a good question. Because, again, if we start thinking like Trump, that is, rationally, then it is clear that if you are 74 years old, then do you want to drag out time until you are 79? And there to decide on something. Maybe you should take what they give you, as they say. Yes. And how does his psyche work, in your opinion? It seems to me that it doesn't work like that if they discuss with Dimpen that they need to live up to 150 years. He may think that he has a lot of time in the future. It could be a defensive reaction. He doesn't look like a man who thinks he doesn't have much time, you know. It may be an irrational perception, but don't you see that everything about this war is irrational? Because from a rational point of view, a reasonable person, even a dictator, would agree to this wonderful proposal of Trump. Well, of course, in the first win. Donetsk and Luhansk regions, the demarcation line. We recognize the Russian Crimea, lift sanctions, and return assets. And this is in a situation where you can still fight, God knows how long, and they tell you, you have been fighting for 4 years, and have achieved nothing. Take what they give you. We give you more, even than you can take. We will persuade Europe to buy your oil and gas. What else do you need? Do you want to fight like this for another 4 years, in conditions of complete hopelessness? Putin's approach to Ukraine is the approach of a maniac, it is irrational. Do you understand? It's like an approach, if we go back to the island of Epstein, a pervert who wants to rape a child. But this child is in the next room. He beat his head from the door of the room. They say to him, listen, go to the next room, there are 10 wonderful girls brought to you, right from Epstein. If you've already come to the island, and we'll give you more money for each one. Just go, calm down. Don't bang your head against the door of the room, you can't go there. And you won't get there. It's not that you can't go there. You can't open this door for God knows how long. And he doesn't want anything else. Except how to get there. Here is a typical behavior of a maniac for you. Putin should be dealt with by doctors, not politicians. That's the thing. Because his attitude to Russia, Russia to Ukraine, his attitude to Ukraine, it's manic. There is no rationality in this. And he invents everything to himself that right now it will definitely work out. I'll get it right now. And all the time, this date is postponed. And he does not notice the objective reality. Maybe he doesn't notice that he is 74, that he is 74 years old. Well, we were on the air for 45 minutes. 20,000 viewers. There are 40 viewers watching us right now, live. Almost 5,900 viewers, well, about 6,000. Put your likes. The last thing I want to say, ending the broadcast, you know, is as always, as every broadcast. I urge, especially now, especially at this moment, to subscribe to Feigen VPN. The fact is that a new wave of blockages has begun in Russia today. It has already been reported from everywhere that YouTube is not available, and that Telegram is not available. There is already howling even from the front, where they say that they actively use this Telegram to solve communication tasks within the framework of their so-called, and so on. And judge for yourself, Feigen, a VPN tool that normal people need. It helps to continue to maintain access to social networks, to messengers, and, in general, use them first for information exchange, the second for communication. Feigen VPN is a reliable way. It has proven in all conditions of tightening access to network resources, blocked, prohibited, and so on, its efficiency and security. In general, I encourage viewers, especially from Russia, but not only those who watch us in other places, to subscribe to Feigen VPN. I say right away, subscribe for a year. God knows what it will be tomorrow. Why try to extend it? Then it creates some access problems and so on. And if you signed up for a year, you will definitely have this tool for solving your tasks all the time. Because through the Telegram bot, Feigen VPN bot, there is a link in this chat, but also on the Feigen LifePoint website, there is not. In the description of this video, there is a link on this page, which we are showing you now. You can see that you can directly subscribe to Feigen VPN for a year, with cards that have access to the Visa MasterCard payment system. Well, or accordingly, it means through a Telegram bot, if you have Russian cards and do not have such access. Once again and again, I urge you to do this. Thread. And if you doubt your own VPNs, which you are currently using, switch to fake VPNs. This is also a great way. Well, we're finishing up. We thank Vitaly for finding the opportunity to come to us on the air. We thank all the viewers. And soon we'll all see you again in the same company. Good luck.